Great. Now on to the next question. Question 2. And I think it was a little bit hinted about our statement, so I'll get to it. Question 2, since the murder of George Floyd and the subsequent protests, we heard of statements by institutions condemning police brutality and supporting Black Lives Matter and anti-racist work. In our own statement, we acknowledge that anti-racist work must go beyond making statements and talking about racism and white supremacy to taking action and promoting ways for people to take action themselves. In general, what are your thoughts about these statements? What type of short-term and long-term actions should libraries and the profession take to fulfill these statements? What type of actions can individuals take to support these statements? Ashley, you are first.
Thanks, David. I want to just mention, I feel like I'm starting all of these things with, I'm just going to mention this one caveat. I can only speak with my lived experience and my focus. So I am not a Black woman. I am a hidden Indigenous woman. I am white coded. And so that influences how I engage with this work and how I move through the world. And on some level, it gives me this weird sense of privilege of being considered white. A lot of times, I think there's a lot of disprivilege with growing up in that space. And so that is sort of where I'm bringing some of my answers in. And so when I think about this in the context of that lived experience, of my education and my work within the Indigenous Curriculum Resource Center, and all of the statements that have come out this year around Black Lives Matter and anti-racist work, we really need to start moving beyond statements. And I know that was the question, but I really want to stress that we need to do the work. I just came out of the Minnesota Institute for Early Career Librarians of Underrepresented Groups, and we looked at this one document that talked about the different levels of change. And to me, we kind of seem to get stuck on this idea about bringing in new voices and learning from new voices, and we never progress past that. And on some level, I think these statements are just another way of looking at other voices, particularly with the Indigenous lens around education. If we look back to our history, which is not often taught in school, so it's really difficult to do, but Indigenous communities and nations have been calling for change for decades, if not centuries, from when the first treaties were signed. David sort of alluded to this, that there's some concerns around the idea of a treaty and what's being upheld in treaty obligations by the colonial governments. At that time, it was the British government. Now it's the Canadian government. And the responsibilities that came with that, particularly around education. In this context, there's a lot of other responsibilities that are not being fulfilled that Indigenous communities are still waiting for. And so it's great that we're addressing that we need to move past statements, but the fact that we're still talking about statements in and of itself can be a problem. And so I have a few notes, and I really think what we need to do is start with education. And I appreciate what my panelists said in relation to the first question around learning and change, how change has to come from different ways. And I do think learning can be very transformational, but we can't move directly into changing our policies if we are not learning ourselves about what this work means and coming to it with not only an open heart and an open mind, but an understanding of what these terms mean, because we all think about them in different ways based on our own lived experiences. And so education can be transformational, but we also can't change anything until we ourselves engage in some of this work. And sometimes this can be, excuse the cat, sometimes this can be challenging because from the outward, it looks like we're not doing a lot because what we're doing is internal work. But we can't get to the external work if we are not doing that internal work. And so there's a workshop that a colleague and I facilitate about coming to terms with the university's colonial roots in relation to reconciliation. And in it, we ask people to think about why doing this work is meaningful to them, and what barriers they may face. And that's reflective private work. And then we talk about how we recognize that this work is huge. As Maha said, like, I can't indigenize the academic library that I work in on my own. There's just no way. I am one contract employee. It's not going to happen. But if I start with myself and I'm here today sharing, and I talk with colleagues in other libraries, I talk with my family, I talk with my community that I'm building of Métis folks out here, I can slowly kind of bring all of these pieces together, I think is what I'm trying to get at. And so in this workshop, we talk about how this work is huge and it is really hard. And one of the barriers a lot of us face is this notion of we don't want to fail and we don't want to make mistakes, which in and of itself is a colonialist white supremacist notion. And so if we don't start, we can't go forward. And if we don't go forward, we can't start. And so that starting piece has to come from within. And so in the workshop, we ask people to take small steps, and we call them your 15% steps. And you can think of them as 10%. The percentage number itself doesn't really matter. What matters is that you're taking that first step and you're engaging in some sort of work. So for some folks here today could be your first step on this work, and that is wonderful. And I applaud you for recognizing that you need this education and you're here, and hopefully we can give you some guidance. And then maybe tomorrow or next week you do something else little, and there's your next step. And eventually you will have done a lot of steps that'll help you progress in your own learning in this work that hopefully you can bring into your practice, and then into committees, and then eventually into policy change. But we can't get to policy change without these small steps. And of course, all of this needs support at a manager level and beyond within the institutional level. And so I'm just checking my notes because there's some things I think are relevant here, but they're also relevant to other questions, and I don't want to be repeating myself. And so I don't have a concrete list of how to take action and promote these ways. I can't give you a to-do list or a checklist, because that's not what this work needs. This work has a lot of to-do lists and checklists, and we need to move beyond that. I do think there needs to be parallel activities. So it can't be just institutions, and it can't be just individuals, and it can't be just LIS education. We all need to bring that. All three need to come together and start working on this stuff at the same time, because we can't have change if people are not being educated on the topics, or to be taught critically to think about these topics. I'm just going to take a quick, I think I'm going to stop there and save some of my other points for some of the other questions, and hear what the other panelists have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashley. And Norda, you're up.
Okay, so as a Black woman, as a Black librarian, as a Black person, obviously, you know, with the murders and the protests, you know, that has taken an emotional, you know, toll on me. I have, you know, I've seen these statements, and I kind of echo what David said about the pessimism, right? And so I recognize that some of these statements, some of our colleagues who have read these statements, it's the first time that they've heard of such things, and therefore, you know, the limelight of Black Lives Matter is new to some. And I look at the statements, and I see various statements, whether it's coming from the institution, the university, it's coming from the unions, it's coming from the library. And I find it's very interesting how it kind of denies some of the work. It feels like, oh, this is something that's new. It doesn't really recognize the work that BIPOC librarians, archivists, people have been working on around making change and bringing light and challenging things that are happening in their spaces. And so, you know, I don't like the statements. I try not to be pessimistic. There are some things that I like, that some of the statements that call out whiteness, some of the statements that actually talk about colonialism, those are great. I like, the problem with the statements is some of the statements, it feels like this is, it's a call to action, but I like to hear what, I've seen some statements that actually say, this is how we're going to, this is how we plan to act based on this, and based on anti-Black racism, we commit to. I don't like every time I read those statements, I hate the word commit. I feel like that's a coded word. I'm like, I would like to do analysis someday of all the commitments, because that's coded word, commit, and these statements come out, and you know, I feel the hypocrisy in that. We commit to that, and we're committed because of this in this moment in time. But, and I'm speaking for my institution, but you know, we've had opportunities. BIPOC colleagues have, you know, I have voiced, you know, concerns, and nothing's happened. So I find it, I find that BIPOC, the work of BIPOC before this, you know, before the trendiness and before the spotlight and limelight is being ignored, largely in those statements, and that upsets me. I know that we want to move from statements to action, and I agree with you, Ashley, about the parallel, you know, activities, but I feel like the statements, so they say, okay, we recognize that this is awful, we need to do better. They don't recognize the work that is already done by their colleagues, and ignoring that work. But I think the work is needed. Like, I think before we move into action, that everyone needs to reflect and learn to look inward, and start with, if it's going to be an anti-racist approach, you're going to start with these, your motivations, right? And so, you know, what really gets me upset is that, and I've spoken with a lot of non-librarians, but a lot of my other Black friends and family members, we talk about this. This is not the first time this has happened. And so you know, my concern, and I'm trying, David, to move away from the pessimism, is what's going to happen a year from now. You know, will there be the same level of interest in terms, and the horror, you know, of doing, you know, fighting against these systems and policies, and anti-Black racism? So I struggle, because I like to think I'm an optimist, naturally. So those statements. So I could say a lot about that, but I think it's important to, in terms of action, like, start these conversations about anti-Black racism, white supremacy in the library. Listen to those BIPOC colleagues. You know, what kind of conversations are you having around policing in the library, right? I don't know if anyone makes the connection. I've brought up the issue of policing in the library. That was not, it was not seen as an important topic, or you know, I feel, as a person that is a Black person, when I bring up things, it is, I have less power and less voice, and my concerns are not being recognized, because there is that threat that is coming from a Black person. So police in the library, I see that as a problem, and we should talk about it. But those empowered do not see that, because they don't have this lived experience. What's going to be interesting is, now that this has come to light, what will then the library do in terms of having those conversations?